Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Perfect Prey. I'm so glad you're here. I welcome you to this podcast if you are someone suffering coercive control and or your children are suffering coercive control, the experiences of growing up in a family system where there is an abuser who is dominating the family system. I am so honored today to have my dear friend and colleague here, Lisa Fontes, PhD, who is also the author of Invisible Chains and Overcoming Coercive Control in Your Intimate Relationship. This is the second book on coercive control, and as you can see, it is very read-worthy. I'm so grateful to have you here, Lisa. Thank you for coming.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you. Good to be with you, Christine. Yes, I treasure our friendship and our collaboration.
Yeah, we are so blessed to have connected, right? For sure. So perhaps what we can do is begin with just your definition of coercive control and how you see coercive control. Can we start there?
Sure, absolutely. So, coercive control is a strategy that one person uses to dominate their intimate partner. It can include tactics such as physical abuse, sexual abuse, litigation abuse, verbal abuse, isolation, manipulation, gaslighting, and controlling someone through the children. Post-separation abuse is a form of coercive control after the separation. And not all of these tactics have to be present, but there is more than one.
Right, right. You said something I think that's important to highlight. I think I keep seeing in various places people talking about coercive control as invisible abuse. People actually don't seem to see it clearly that it can be, of course, physically violent and sexually violent. That coercive control is not only the psychological strategies, right?
For me, the way I think about it is that the has a tool chest.
Mhm.
And in that tool chest, all the things I mentioned and some more. And not everybody chooses to use all the tools or not all the time. So there are coercively controlling abusers who never use physical violence or never use sexual violence, but they are still coercively controlling. But certainly where there is physical abuse, there are usually more strategies at the same time. Sometimes people do dismiss them. They talk about them as being subtle or mild or something of that sort. But of course, none of these strategies are mild, and they're not even necessarily subtle. They may be more subtle than getting a black eye, but there's nothing subtle about having no access to money, let's say, or being totally cut off from your family. Those are really grave harms.
Yeah, no, I think that's so well put. I love the idea of like how we talk about it as a pattern to slowly erode away someone's autonomy. So it could be subtle, but it doesn't have to be subtle, right? It depends on, I feel like, and maybe correct me or tell me how you feel about this, but I feel like it also depends on how much the abuser thinks they have to intensify their behaviors to gain that control.
It's over time, as you say, it's a pattern of behavior over time. And part of the harm is that it is over time. And the abuser can be milder or more severe, more obvious, more subtle, more financial abuse today, more intimidation. That's one that I didn't mention. That's a tactic, a really important tactic that I didn't mention. Or use more intimidation tomorrow, depending on what suits their mood. One of the tactics is love-like acts. So acts that on the surface look loving, but their intention is to keep the other person bonded to them when they're ready to leave. So
Mhm.
frequently, when someone has had it with coercive control and they either express verbally that they're going to leave or the abuser can sense that, then the abuser will come with tickets to show and an invitation to dinner and let's look at the book of photos of our children and here's a gift certificate to go get your nails done or whatever the dynamic is in the particular relationship. It's an attempt, it looks like love to people who don't know, and in other relationships it may be an expression of love, but in a coercive control relationship it's another tool to hold on to the person who's being victimized.
Like that intermittent reinforcement, or we people call it breadcrumbing, right? And it's a way to lure somebody back in. I think about sometimes with clients, what I've noticed is the more that the abuser feels like they've lost control, the more that those loving experiences become a little less loving. They become more domineering. It becomes more of that overt intimidation. I'm going to send you flowers if that doesn't work, or I'm going to say, let's go out to dinner. And if that doesn't work, then maybe I'm going to say something like, if you leave me, you'll never see the children again. Or if you leave me, you're going to lose the house or you're going to lose everything we built together. They have to intensify if they're not actually retaining the control. Does that make sense? Does that?
I think it does, absolutely. And this dynamic can be replayed again and again over years or even decades. I don't think of it as a cycle. There doesn't seem to really be any evidence that there's a cycle of abuse. There's what some people who thought about this 30, 40 years ago called the honeymoon period is usually just a period in which the person who's being victimized is doing everything possible to please the abuser and appease the abuser so they will not be attacked.
hmm Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and it's this wearing down of someone that does make us victims and survivors very exhausted, and then have this almost giving up. I'll just stay in the relationship, or to your point, what you mentioned before is coercive control can be intensified post-separation. So we often say, why didn't she leave? But the reality is sometimes it might get worse when a victim leaves, right?
Often it does. We know that's the most risky period for homicide, unfortunately, or near fatal assaults. And also, a lot of women, especially, will stay in their relationships if there are children because they believe that they can protect the children better in the relationship. At a certain point, it often becomes untenable. It's not good for them, and they can see the harm that is caused to the children by living in that kind of pressure cooker. Because the person who abuses their partner is going to use the very same tactics with their children eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking about how you probably are very familiar with this with cases that you've had and when you testify to support victims and survivors. Can you talk a little bit about the family court experiences that you've had?
Sure. So I work in family cases. I work also in civil criminal cases with victims of coercive control who are being charged with crimes or have been convicted of crimes. And I work on immigration cases as well. And they are almost uniformly absolutely heartbreaking. And I've met some very brave, courageous, bright people who end up in these situations. And I'm pleased when I can help them. I can help them in different ways. Sometimes I'll do a deep dive into their situation, read a ton of documents, evaluate them, offer to evaluate their ex-partner, and write a report. Sometimes I'll testify as a subject matter expert without the case knowledge. And I'm doing more of that these days, and it works out to be less expensive for the client. And also, some judges prefer it because they see me as being more of a neutral expert in that case. So in terms of case actual material from cases, it's hard to know what to say. I have worked with people who were unbelievably wealthy. I've worked with people who had very prestigious jobs. I've worked with people who had not a penny to their name, who were literally living in their cars. I've worked with people with high levels of education. I've worked with people with low levels of education, and really every religion, including some people who had very traditional religions and interesting ways that interacted with the abuse. In some cases, there was substance abuse on the part of the abuser. Many there wasn't. In some, there was substance abuse on the part of the victim. One of the things that I'm seeing more and more these days is DARVO, which I'm sure you've discussed here, but it's when the abuser denies, attacks, and reverses victim and offender, so that you'll have a custody battle, typically, where the abuser will try to say either, no, the other party attacked me, or they'll say, we both attacked each other, so we're both guilty of domestic violence. And most of the cases that I work on these days have that dynamic. I just testified in one this week and one a couple of weeks ago. So that is very confusing a lot of times for judges and even confusing for attorneys. Like, what's really going on here? And with a heterosexual couple, it can sound like he said, she said. So you have to look at the evidence. You have to look at the evidence really closely.
Mhm. Yeah. No, it sounds very challenging. And I know we've had these discussions before where it's almost sometimes like a setup where an abuser will almost be able to use that in court to gain more time of the children, even though there's been a history, again, this pattern of coercive control throughout the course of the relationship. I think rather frustrating, I think is what I would say. It's also frustrating to see this unravel. I'm sure you agree, right?
I would go beyond frustrating. It can be absolutely heartbreaking.
Hmm.
Part of a Darvo strategy can be what I coined provoke and record, which is where the abuser will either have installed cameras throughout the house with or without the knowledge of the victim, or will just be using their phone or something one-time device and will deliberately provoke the victim so the victim responds in some way that looks really bad, throws something, breaks something, knocks something off the table, curses. I've seen abusers
Pushes pushes the perpetrator maybe,
right,
right?
hold
Yeah.
them back. Yeah.
Hmm.
I've seen situations where the abuser deliberately approached the victim from behind while she was chopping vegetables and said something outrageous, and she turns around with a knife in her hand and says, "You better not, whatever." And the abuser then takes these short little clips and is the first one to file for a protective order. This is a particularly heartbreaking situation, and I just wrote about it, where the abuser ends up either getting the first protective order against their victim, or they both have protective orders against each other. And that is, again, complicated for judges to figure out and can be absolutely heartbreaking. Some kids have seen the mom who they know has been victimized led away in handcuffs. And that's very confusing, of course, to children.
And then understanding that when you are a trauma victim and you're in this space of being cornered or trapped or know you're being recorded, that a dysregulated state or a dysregulated reaction could almost be normal if you understand trauma, right? And that judges are not necessarily educated on what trauma can look like. And that's, I think, back to your word, heartbreaking, right? When you know a victim has experienced days, weeks, months, or years of being coercively controlled, and then the one time they may react in a way that feels egregious is really just from years. I call it the percolating coffee pot. At some point, you're going to explode when you've been over and over again having these types of experiences.
I think that's true. Also, though, sometimes the reaction, I would say, does not necessarily come out of the history of trauma, but can become out of the provocation at that moment. Like the 5 or 10 minutes that came right before it
Hmm.
but the abuser's not recording during that time,
Hmm.
that anybody would turn around and they happen to have a knife in their hand because they're chopping vegetables
No
and would
kidding.
look menacing.
Yeah.
And,
Anybody
and
would turn around and have that reaction.
right.
Exactly.
And it's sometimes you have a situation where one person is rather large, an experienced fighter, maybe ex-military or former military or something, and the other one is really quite petite, and they try to act as if this is a mutual
Mhm.
situation. There is no such thing as mutual domestic violence.
That's right.
Maybe sometimes couples fight, but that's not what we see mostly. What we see is one person dominating the other, and the person who's being dominated sometimes strikes back
Hmm.
or tries to resist the domination.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So what I think you're saying too is that this idea is that in family court and perhaps in other courts where you work, there is a lack of understanding about what this can look like in relationship dynamics. Like that there is an ability oftentimes, or maybe not oftentimes, but certainly there's an ability for abusers to be able to create a narrative that calls into question the narrative of the victim. Is that
Exactly.
accurate? Hmm.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So your job is fulfilling or
Yeah, no, it's incredibly fulfilling and feels very meaningful, but it's also, of course, frustrating because I don't have all the power. And some attorneys are great and some aren't, and some judges are great and some aren't. And there's so many, some parental evaluators are great, some aren't. Go down the list.
right.
And so it's every situation is very different, which makes it really interesting, but also keeps me up at night.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So you write wonderful articles that are very validating of victims, survivors' experiences. And what are you working on presently?
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for holding up Invisible Chains. It was the second book ever written on coercive control, and Evan Stark gave me his blessing, which meant a lot to me when I was writing it. So I just turned in an article on mutual protective orders, and I am working on one on complex post-traumatic stress disorder and one with a colleague on the effects of domestic violence on the oldest child in a family.
Interesting.
So I've always got a lot of things going. I like writing short pieces for the public these days more than I do scholarly pieces. I've written a couple of dozen scholarly pieces, but I really enjoy getting these pieces out there. And I've had more than 2 million readers on just on psychologytoday.com. I feel great being able to reach people in that way. Yeah.
No, it's wonderful. I think one of the things we should mention about your book is that you give little scenarios, like examples about what this could look like in a dynamic between a victim and an abuser. Because I think what happens is, and I'm sure you agree, is that oftentimes victims have a lot of self-doubt. They don't really know if what they're experiencing is truly abuse, and then they question themselves. I think that I found that extremely helpful when I read your book a long time ago, by the way. And I found it validating in my own healing journey. I think that's the one thing about your articles is that you put in these examples where people can say, oh, that's what that looks like in a relationship dynamic. It's not just you talking about it, but oh, there's a father and a mother and a child, and this is the dynamic that's occurring, and it helps. I know it's helpful. So thank you so much for doing that, really.
Yeah, it's definitely my pleasure to be able to do that. And someone who's in a coercive control relationship, first of all, has probably never heard the term. So if there is physical violence, they probably can name that's wrong. But if there is no physical violence, or the physical violence is subtle, like their abuser is making them having sex in a painful way, let's say, which isn't actually subtle, but it's hidden, it's disguised, then they may, as you said, not be able to identify what's going on in the relationship. First, getting the concept of coercive control, which I'm so grateful to Evan Stark for, really helps connect these dots between all these things like, I don't really like that, and that kind of makes me uncomfortable, and I wish this would change. And then you have this name. Whoa, it's all part of a strategy with all these different tactics, which are meant to keep me penned in so this other person can access my resources. And what are
Yeah,
those resources? Sex, access to children, in many cases, not all cases, housekeeping, food preparation, money, a lot of time.
mhm.
And so those are some of the resources that abusers will tap into. Could be
Absolutely.
prestige, could be more. Yeah.
Yeah, Evan, I think has said a control of time and space, right? And whatever that looks like for you, it can be varied. I think you probably know this, but I'm not sure all my listeners do, is that when I originally went on to get my doctorate in clinical social work, I was researching psychological abuse. And
Mhm.
and then happened upon Evan's work. And
Right.
that's when I said, oh my gosh, this is everything. It's
Okay.
not just
Right.
these psychological strategies that were being used on me, but it was all of these other things that I hadn't even really been able to identify. So that was extremely empowering. And that's when I made the pivot. And I'm so grateful to him for all of his work and the voice he's given to so many people. Yeah, I think we're both
Yeah.
really grateful, right? Yeah.
I think people talk a lot of times about verbal abuse or emotional abuse or psychological abuse. And when I see those, much of the time, I won't say all the time, but much of the time, there's actually a lot more going on. There's
Hmm.
this whole universe of coercive control, of which maybe the verbal abuse is the most visible part. So getting all those little tactics names can be really helpful for people. And then it shows up really idiosyncratically. In one couple, the abuser will control their victim's bedtime. In another couple, they'll control what they eat or the clothes they wear. In another couple, it's just constant jealousy. So it manifests in all different kinds of
Hmm.
ways.
Yeah, so many varied ways. I think that's the point, right? Is that it can be that you're just maybe not allowed to go get your nails done, or that you probably shouldn't be out with friends tonight. And so you're going to get numerous texts about when are you coming home? Why aren't you home yet? I miss you. It could be I miss you. I love you, shrouded in this worry, concern, or love when it's actually about controlling. And I think for young people in particular, in a program I run at the college where I teach, it's like really engaging them in the conversation about how it could look like love, it could feel like love, but it may not be that. Questioning that, it's so important. Yeah.
Poison in a candy wrapper of love.
Oh,
Yeah.
I love that. That's a great one. I might have to take that one. Yeah. Thank you so much.
My
I so
pleasure.
appreciate you for so many reasons, and you know that. And we are so grateful to have you doing this work. I think some of our listeners probably should be aware that I do the clinician, attorney, and coach training so that anybody who's interested in becoming really greater, fuller awareness about coercive control and how it's inflicted. It's a 14-hour training with 14 CEs. But then some of these people who are licensed mental health counselors can certainly move on to Lisa's expert witness training if that's something that they're interested in doing. We need to create a sea of allies, as I keep saying. And as the more people that we have who truly understand this, I think that's where we'll begin to see more shifts.
And for the expert witness training, what I would want people to know is it really is not just for people who are going to serve in the role of expert witness, which is an important but limited role, but it could also be very relevant for people who are parental evaluators, guardians ad litem, have any role to do with the courts, because it's a lot about testifying, writing reports, yeah,
That's fantastic. I
evaluating
appreciate you
people.
adding that
Yeah,
on.
sure.
Yes, no, for sure. And that training is coming up for those of you listening. That will be another clinician training is coming up in the beginning of May, and then Lisa's going to be offering this expert witness training towards the end of May, middle of May and end of May. So we hope that you'll take advantage of that, and we're so grateful to have you here listening. And thank you, Lisa, for being here
Thank
today.
you. Pleasure.
Don't forget to buy the book, everybody. Bye.